Welcome to Irvine Valley College and our Performing Arts Center. My name is Gary Reibold, and I'm proud to have the British debate team on our campus for the 8th time in our history of a debate team. We have a proud tradition of international debate on our campus. We've had 13 total teams. We've had teams from Africa, from Eastern Europe, and from China. We're also involved with traveling to the People's Republic of China. We've gone to 6 different individual tournaments or demonstrations, taking over 80 students and coaches. And we plan another nice-sized trip this May, coming up May of 2013. We also have a tradition of excellence on the team. You'll see that our team captains here are sitting representing our team. We're part of our national championship squad. We were ranked the national champions in 2 different categories of community college, one for the National Parliamentary Debate Association, where we have to compete against 4-year schools, and one at Phi Rho Pi, which is just the community college nationals. At the Phi Rho Pi tournament, we had 98 points. Number 2 had 66. So we were one of the strongest teams that we've ever presented to the field. We'd like to start off the debate by thanking our sponsors for tonight. Especially, we'd like to thank the Hilton Orange County over in Costa Mesa for providing excellent accommodations for the British debaters. We'd like to thank our Irvine Valley College Foundation, who has sponsored many of our demonstration debates in the past, Dr. Glenn Rockmore, our IVC president, and Dr. David Gatewood, who's the dean of the School of Fine Arts. I'd also like to take this chance to thank all of the other coaches on our team. We have 9 coaches, many of which are not paid to do coaching, but do it only because of their love for debate and for the forensics activity. My co-director of forensics, Edwin Tiongson, is sitting over here at the front. Thank you, Eddie, for being here. And several of our coaches who could not be here tonight because they're teaching, some of which who are here. We have Bill Neeson, Kevin Calderwood, Jennifer Page, Jules Throckmorton-French, Lisa Rios, and Chatty Anderson. Thank you all for being coaches. So let's introduce the debaters. Tonight, we have 2 of our captains who will be on the proponency side that is for veganism. Our opening speaker will be Udara Apkasera. Udara, stand up, please. Okay. As you can see from the program, she's interested in hopefully transferring to UCLA next fall and in a legal career. The second speaker on the proponency side will be Jennifer Georgievich. Jennifer is also interested in transferring to a UC and as a psych major. So we have legal and the psychology fields represented today. On the opposition side, the first speaker here will be Eddie Bailey King. Eddie, of course, has just recently graduated from English literature, and what I found very interesting was that she was a Fulbright scholar over in Pennsylvania, so she's already had a chance to see the East Coast, although her trip here on the West Coast is going to be a rather quick one. She's been to the United States before. Her partner in the second position is Willard Foxton. Willard has already graduated and qualified as a barrister and was embedded with troops in Afghanistan. So he's got a wide range of experience. Both of them may be a little bit jet lagged. They came in at midnight last night after their flight was delayed in New York. Then, of course, the 405 was closed down. So cleverly, they're only working on about 6 hours sleep. So we'll see if that levels the field out a little bit. Our motion tonight is that now is the time for worldwide veganism. The format will basically be, starting with the proponency, each one of the debaters will get an 8-minute speech. So we'll go from the proponency, opponency, proponency, opponency. Then we will conclude with 2 5-minute speeches, starting with the proponency that are rebuttal speeches, no new arguments, where they will summarize what the major issues are and why they think they're winning the debate. I'll be giving time signals sitting in the front seat here, front row here, so if you see me clap my hands once, that's usually a sign of 1 minute has gone by. So
I would like to say good evening to everybody, and once again, thank our wonderful coaching staff and the administration, as well as our IVC president, Dr. Glenn Rockmore, and the dean of the School of Fine Arts, Dr. David Gatewood. So thank you, and with that, I'd like to begin. Our resolution for today is now is the time for worldwide veganism. Let us begin with the model. Western liberal democracies and the UN aid programs can shape world change with policy. They should use this power to switch the world mindset to that of a better and healthier diet. Currently, Western liberal democracies' culinary characterization in other countries is represented by some of America's finest dining establishments, like McDonald's and KFC. They should undermine the meat-centric trend of which they are the greatest cause by sponsoring vegan policies. When Western liberal democratic nations show that they prioritize, support, and prefer vegan food choices, the global climate will change. If the United States' influence can put over 33,000 McDonald's in 133 countries, Western liberal democracies can also shift global food trends in the opposite direction. The Burger King and Colonel Sanders' oily reign needs to be put to an end before it's too late. This is possible through aid and education. Oxfam and the UN are preparing for a possible second global food crisis in 5 years. Oxfam forecasts the prices of corn and wheat spiking from the drought. So the GROW campaign promotes growing more food while combating climate change in order to help poorer countries grow economically to produce their own food. If they focused on and only supported vegan options, they can educate on sustainable crops while investing in small-scale agriculture. U.S. food aid and UN World Food Programs can also support a vegan diet. The World Food Program provides to about 90 million people per year. The Red Cross and World Food Program currently have vegetable sources of protein because many religious groups either don't eat meat or only eat meat during certain seasons. And vegetable protein is both easy to preserve and inexpensive to transport. So expanding this existing capability to all aid will not be a missed stake. Next, we'll move on to the necessity of why we need to promote worldwide veganism. We should support our model in order to sustain human life in the short and long term. First, let's look at the short term in order to prevent food shortages. First, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 925 million people go hungry and 2 billion are malnourished, and the number is rising, so there is no margin for error. Second, the world agriculture produces enough to provide everyone in the world with 2,720 kilocalories per day, but much of this goes to feed livestock. And only 2% of the corn grown in the U.S. is eaten as corn by humans. 80% is fed to cows. By 2050, the estimated population is about 9 billion. There will be only enough water to produce adequate crops for all of these people if an animal-based food is limited to 5% of the total agriculture, because an animal-based food diet consumes 5 to 10 times more water than a vegetarian diet. So now if we look at what goes into a quarter-pound hamburger, we'll see that, I'll take your point.
It's interesting that you're bringing up the world food shortages, but you're talking about cutting down the actual amount of food available. Surely if there's a big difference between Americans being able to eat burgers. Yes, it's sad that Africans at the same time can't eat corn, but the one can't move to the other. So how are you going to solve the distribution problems?
Well, actually, we're not trying to decrease the amount of food that is being produced or being supplied. Currently, World Aid food programs do reach, like I said before, about 90 million people per year from the World Food Program alone. So we would be shifting the mindset over to a vegan diet instead of eliminating all food altogether. So continuing on with what is in a quarter-pound hamburger, about 6 pounds of grain and forage, 52 gallons of water, 74 square feet of land, and enough energy to power a microwave for 18 minutes. So if we look now to the long-term necessity, we'll see that we can prevent further environmental damage. First, let's look at cow flatulence. The UN has declared methane from cow emissions the greatest threat to our climate, forest, and wildlife. Livestock emissions are responsible for 18% of the greenhouse gases that cause global warming, and that really stinks. Second, land area. Grazing occupies 26% of Earth's terrestrial surface. Crop feed production uses 1/3 of all arable land. Now if we look to water, meat production accounts for 70% of human water waste, mainly for feed crop irrigation. The largest source of water pollutants associated with meat production includes animal wastes, antibiotics, hormones, chemicals, fertilizers, and pesticides. Now, all of these generate about 2/3 of the anthropogenic ammonia, which can lead to acid rain and acidification of the ecosystems. Now, these impacts are already being shown. For one, in May of 2000, cattle manure runoff caused E. coli-contaminated water in Ontario, which caused about 1,300 cases of gastroenteritis and 6 deaths. Additionally, the current worldwide drought we're in is a result of this. Pollution creates artificial environments with extreme weather conditions like drought, floods, hurricanes. So we can only milk our environment for so long. Finally, we can look to the justification. Worldwide veganism is good for both humans and animals. First, some health concerns. First, we'll look to beef production, and we'll see that cows are fed corn as a cheap substitute for grass. And corn makes cows extremely sick, so they're dosed with 29 million pounds of antibiotics per year. Beef consumption, which has doubled over the last 50-year time span, is linked to heart disease and cancer. But the meat of the problem is that the widespread of antibiotics on animals makes bacteria more resistant, making it more difficult to treat human illnesses. A vegan diet, on the other hand, can lower cholesterol and blood pressure and lessens the risk of hypertension and type 2 diabetes. Now, it's important to consider that it can also lessen the risk of heart disease when the World Health Organization reports that about 17 million people die annually from cardiovascular diseases.
Madam,
Yes, I'll take your
if
point.
that's the case, then shouldn't educated citizens opt to eat fewer red meat products? They can also choose to eat red meat or less healthy foods when they like to. Why do you have the right to tyrannically presuppose what people want to eat?
Well, we're not necessarily forcing people to eat these types of food, but we're saying that it would be beneficial for them, and by promoting these types of, a lot of the reasons that people don't eat these types of food is because it's not available, because of how meat-centric our economy and industry is right now. So if we move to this mindset, people will want to change and eat these healthier foods for these reasons. We also have some philosophical justification. When we look to the fact that meat is consumed as a status food culturally, but is not physically needed, we'll be putting an end to the unnecessary destruction of life, which will give us peace of mind. An animal raised for food is being used for others rather than respected for itself. People are disengaged from the killing process, and meat seems to come from packages and not animals. So what's wrong with eating a poodle patty? For most of us, it's a cultural taboo, but there's no real difference between cats and dogs and cows and pigs. So for all of these reasons, we urge that you vote for the affirmative.
Sorry, I have about 600 pieces of paper. I should have thought this through. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming here tonight. It's an enormous privilege for me and Willard to come and represent the United Kingdom here, and we're so glad that you could all come out and show your support. We'd like to say a huge thank you to all of the staff here at IVC, to the English-speaking union back in the UK, to the National Communication Association, and to all the other people whose hard work have made this tour possible. It's a joy to be here. So, firstly, what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk to you about the fact that we of the opposition don't think animals have rights. We essentially think that it's really nice if we choose to confer rights upon these lovely, fluffy, smelly little creatures, but we don't think there's any principled grounds for doing so. It's just a kind of act of kindness. Secondly, I'm going to bring up some of the practical consequences of what Prop have tried to tell us and show you why they're essentially disastrous. And thirdly, I'm just going to pick some kind of, again, logical holes in the case that they have offered us. us. I'm going to bring it back to the idea that if your huge problem is using animals for human gain, then we're going to have to restructure the whole of human society and not just the food-related bit. Okay, so before I go on to the first point, just a little bit of rebuttal of some of the points that we recently heard from the proposition. Because a lot of the points that they gave us were things like, well, we can do this, like the UN World Food Programme is widespread and therefore we could deliver this message. Now, we've heard the ways in which it's possible to do this, but we still haven't had a logical reason for why we truly ought to. We've had evidence, we've had suggestion of why it might be advisable, why an educated person might sit back and think, hey, I'm not as healthy as I used to be, I'm gaining weight, why don't I have a meat-free Monday? Sure, but we haven't heard why they should make a jump to changing their entire lifestyle and why entire governments should entirely restructure their economic policy and like the landscape of their entire nation just because there are aspects of eating meat which aren't good. We haven't had enough evidence. Secondly, we don't think that in opposition we have to defend the worst excesses of factory farming. Like, we think that all these examples of pollution in the water, like incredibly carcinogenic runoff and just like awful environmental practices, that's not a reason not to farm animals. That's a reason just to have some laws that structure how we do that. That's a reason to maybe have higher welfare, because it's nice, and like better policies against pollution, because it's better for all of us. So again, we don't think they've given us enough reasons for a blanket ban. Okay, another issue that I'm going to come back to later in my speech, but we had the phrase in the opening speech that we need to change the global climate, and she meant that we need to change the climate of ideas and people's attitudes. But the problem is, if this is a worldwide policy, try and tell the people in the Mongolian, like, Gobi Desert or the people of the Central Asian steppes that they have to stop farming goats, which are the only creatures that can pick sustenance from the arid land. Or try and tell people who live in a specific environment where working with animals is the only efficient way of, like, drawing energy from otherwise indigestible crops. Try and tell them that they can't now pursue that policy. We think this is like a really excessive blanket ban, and we don't really see how it's going to help anything. We also, okay, I'm going to move on to my first point, which is animals don't have rights. Because we think that animals are creatures like any other, and that insofar as humans derive their rights from the way that they engage with other humans, build communities, speak with one another, build laws, work to support their families, and so on, they do this through communication with one another. And when we look at animals, we see that if they derive any rights whatsoever, it's out of us as very privileged citizens of a developed nation saying that we can, because we have like the freedom and the time to look after these animals. There's no necessity. It's not coming from the intrinsic nature of like a little piglet when I look at it that I think, there is a creature worthy of like sophisticated treatment. It's merely that we've now evolved to a point where we're able to do this. And of course, that's really nice. But what we think is that if you apply that fact to the rest of what we do, yes, it's really nice to be able to treat animals with great respect. And like, there's no logical burden alongside that to stop that practice just because the people of prop have told us that it might be kind of bad for our hearts and our waistlines. Now, secondly, we think that because we grant animal protection as a kindness rather than necessity, in actual fact, what's going on in philosophical terms is that animal husbandry is an exchange. It's like a contractual agreement between me and like the cow that I'm going to eat tomorrow, which is that in exchange for like a number of years of feed and nurture and shelter from bad weather, it will eventually have a relatively painless death, and it will eventually evolve into something a little bit more tasty. So we think that as a result of that, we shouldn't be looking upon this as some kind of like tyrannical act which like unfairly forces animals into becoming our meals. If anything, it's an extremely noble exchange, and one that, like, if you track it through human history, really is testament to all the potential of humans and their communities to transcend their environments, and that the people who farm goats or whatever in arid environments don't do so out of true desperation, but also because it's something that kind of enriches and like edifies our human experience, because it's actually kind of beautiful, we think, that we can eat these animals, and we see very few reasons to abstain from doing so. Now, there's also a question as to why this is necessary, because I've told you that we can choose to eat vegetarian protein if we wish to. And I've also told you that, tofu may work for some people in some environments, but there are particular climates which simply cannot host any other protein source other than animals. But the real issue is that if, like, the UN policy is going to attempt to dictate something which every single country follows, we simply need to believe that this can work in line with human behavior. And Willard's going to talk more about communities and why communities have an inherent right to structure how they organize their world. And we think that because food kind of cuts to the heart of everything that it is to be human, everything that it is to feed your families, to celebrate the religious occasions that are important to your life, important to who you are. We think it's doubly important that that be something which is up to the individual, and it's simply not appropriate to talk about there being too much methane in South America because of the cattle, and to say that that's a reason for people in Norway to stop doing whatever it is that they've been doing for millennia. We just don't think it's enough of a burden, if you will. Now, moving on to the practical consequences of this policy, we kind of sat down and thought about this and asked ourselves how this would pan out, if we were to put this policy into effect. We think that if you're going to say that governments can only favour pro-vegan policies, in essence that means leaving all cattle farms and all husbandry which was remotely connected with animals out in the cold. It means pretty much opening up the farm gates and letting the pigs loose, letting everything go. And we think that that's such an irresponsible policy, a piggy genocide, if you will, because they're wildly maladapted for life in the modern world. We think this idea of suddenly shutting down everything that has been evolving for centuries is just really dangerous, because there's room for improvement. We're not going to defend all of the least sustainable and least effective ways of farming animals, but we think this is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And if that's your issue, if pollution is the problem, then let's just return to what we have already, build upon it, improve upon it, and see if we can't be more efficient and more effective. It's pretty patchy logic to say that you can keep house pets or go to the Kentucky Derby and watch some horses not having a great time, and yet you also have to remodel every other aspect of your society. We think that if pain is your criterion, which we're not quite sure because we didn't hear it from Prop, if pain is the issue, then let's all go out and eat mussels and oysters, which have no nervous systems and therefore can experience no pain. So ideal, the perfect foodstuff. In conclusion, what I've talked to you about today is essentially the inadequate grounds we've had for this principled debate, the practical consequences implicit in doing this, and the underlying belief, which we think is stronger, that animals have no rights. It's a pretty tough gig to stand up before a lot of Americans and argue that we simply must have steak, but I do hope I've managed to persuade some of you. Many thanks.
Hello. Before I begin, I'd like to extend just another round of thank yous to especially the Performing Arts Center, the coordinator, Patrick Taylor, as well as the staff, to our wonderful sponsors who made this night possible, and of course, once again, to the British team for battling through Carmageddon to get here. Personally, I would also like to thank you guys for Harry Potter. Just love it. Not bitter about not getting my letter in the mail or anything. It's fine. So, getting right into it. My partner laid out a brilliant plan of why we should definitely embrace worldwide veganism. She set up a wonderful model saying how Western liberalized democracies have a vast influence over the world culture. The responses to this are basically, why should we do this? Why should we structure it? And she did give brilliant points, how it's necessary because of food shortages, the environment, human health, and animal well-being. Additionally, we are trendy. As Western liberalized democracies, we do have the responsibility and the capability to start trends. After the United States stole our government model from the Brits, many nations followed, including Germany, Indonesia. We definitely can catalyze worldwide change this way. It is completely possible. The United States McDonald's needs to stop being so proud of having served 100 billion beef patties and maybe make a few veggie burgers. It's totally possible. Once again, their main argument was that of global policy. I'll take your question.
You say that the entire world will fall into line with this, but can you give me some convincing evidence that the French will say yes?
Of course, we can't say that the French will say yes immediately and for sure, but what we are inspiring is global mindset change, global cultural change, which is completely possible. The fact is that culture changes. I don't see anyone here wearing MC Hammer pants anymore. Change is very possible, and it's once again is influenced by Western liberalized nations. Actually, fun fact, the #1 black market item during Soviet Russia was the blue jean. We have a lot of influence here. All right. So once again, the opposition came up here and said that animals don't have rights, that people are better because we can communicate, and that any rights animals have, we have given them. That's nice. Of course, we like animals. However, we, of course, as humans, as being, I guess, intellectually higher than animals, also do kind of have a responsibility to not exploit them as much as we do. We don't need to be torturing them. That's not okay. But what's even more important, as my partner addressed, and as they did not, are the health concerns, the environmental concerns, and once again, how perpetuating human life is very important, and our plan definitely does help do this. As far as practical implications go, we're not going to let the pigs go. We're not going to be running around to farms and opening the gates, letting livestock run through the towns. That's not our deal. What we're doing is, once again, inspiring cultural change, the best kind of change that people can hopefully decide to follow. And as I've already talked about, it is a very high likelihood that this would happen. Getting back into the meat of the case, this once again is completely necessary because of food shortages. There are millions of people hungry in the world, and when we do have the capabilities and the agricultural output to feed all of them, why aren't we? Why is it okay to feed cows 80% of the corn that humans produce instead of people? This is just not okay. We should not be patting ourselves on the back for this kind of behavior at all. Additionally, my partner brought up that cow flatulence is the main cause of methane in our atmosphere. Humankind should not be okay with just sitting in this noxious fume and letting this happen to us. We should definitely be trying to cut down on environmental damages. My partner also brought up the point of contaminated water, how deaths are occurring because of runoff from these factory farms. Of course, we're not trying to make the other team come up and say that the cruel factory farms are okay, but we are saying that it's completely possible to make them unnecessary, because when the demand for vegan options and vegan food goes up, less factories will be necessary. We won't need them. And all of this baloney that is going on will come finally to a halt. Okay. One other point that was brought up by the British team was that people should have the right to choose what they eat on the individual level. Once again, we completely agree with this. However, by being fashionable, by being the trendy Western liberalized democracies that we are, we hope that we can influence the rest of the world to follow our lead. We're not going to be stealing goats from rural farmers, but we are going to be setting a model that they can follow. We're not having some kind of vegan tyranny over the world. We, once again, are allowing this to happen. So once again, my partner also brought up some philosophical implications, how the reason why we eat some animals and not others are utterly ridiculous. Why is it okay to have, pigs and, cows to eat when actually pigs are smarter than cats and dogs? All this type of preferring one animal over the other doesn't make sense. So because our system doesn't make sense, even though we do admire the British from having mustered up the courage and trying to grill us with all these questions having to do with our case, it is completely necessary that we do follow this model, that we allow food programs, such as the World Food Program, such as Oxfam, such as the GROW program, and such as United States Food Aid, to step in and help the global community out. Okay. So, for these reasons, once again, because animals do have rights, even if it's the people who are giving it to them, because our plan is completely practical, because we're very reasonable, and because we have done a good job of setting this up, and because through our case, our model makes sense, we have got the root of the problem out, we are solving for all of the things that we have set up, and because it is absolutely necessary. In the short term, through food shortages, and in the long term, through protecting our environment from these terrible consequences, we should definitely change for worldwide veganism. It is completely necessary to start this global protocol. And thank you for your time. That's why, once again, you will definitely be voting for the affirmative side.
Ladies and gentlemen, it may not come as a shock to you that a man standing before you wearing a small bear's head as a bag around his waist is not a massive fan of veganism or animal rights. But before I go on to tell you why I'm not a massive fan of veganism or animal rights, I've got to go through, I believe it's a tradition here to go through and do a few thank yous. Now, I've got a bewildering list of acronyms in front of me, NCA, ESU, IVC, and apparently all of those people have helped get us here. But one particular acronym I'd like to thank is PGR, which is Professor Gary Rybold, who's been a fantastic host for us here and has generally sort of looked after us, made sure we got from the airport, and particularly took us out last night for this afternoon, in fact, for Vietnamese pork sandwiches. Now, I'm very grateful to Professor Rybold for doing this, although these people would much rather we went to a UN Bowser in a refugee camp where they would have poured out an ugly, grey mushroom ooze, apparently to save the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel quite sorry for them, because ultimately the task they've been set by their university is they have to stand in front of an American audience and convince them to give up bacon. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that's a pretty tough sell. But unfortunately, it's my obligation to go through and rebut some of the things they've said, and then come on and tell you about some positive, affirmative reasons why they're wrong. The positive, affirmative reasons I'm going to give you in a moment are going to be, first of all, I'm going to talk about the impact this would have on farmers, on communities, and on people's sense of themselves and their sense of what it means to be part of a nation state and to have a culture. I'm going to come on and talk about what this means for our landscape and how our landscape would change under their plans. And finally, I'm going to come on and I'm going to talk about the future, and I'm going to talk about a man called Thomas Malthus and what he predicted in the future, and why hopefully he was wrong, provided we keep growing animals. But first of all, a little bit of rebuttal. First, we had a lot of statistics, ladies and gentlemen, coming out from this side. Now, I don't know how accurate those statistics are. I suspect they're very accurate. But there was a little bit of misleading that went on. So they gave us figures for how many people die every year of heart disease, how many people die every year of cancer. And they said they took that and they said, but eating meat contributes towards this. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe that bringing in veganism will actually prevent death, right? I think cancer will still exist. I think heart disease will still exist. And I think if you get cancer or you get heart disease as a result of eating meat, it's exactly the same as getting cancer or heart disease from smoking. You understand the risks, you take the risks, and as Etty said, you've got a perfect right to make a personal choice. You understand the consequence, you take the risk. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, they said, well, we as trendy Western liberal democracies can set this cultural change. And I'm just not that sure, ladies and gentlemen. At the moment, we've got a situation where we can't convince the Syrians to stop murdering people. We can't convince the Iranians to stop having a bomb. It doesn't matter how trendy, how Western, and how liberal we are. Those things aren't popular in some countries. So I think just waving the big UN magic wand and saying slowly over time this cultural change will happen doesn't necessarily mean anything. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, they said MC Hammer Pants aren't cool anymore. And I think that's just factually untrue. But if I was standing here in a pair of enormous gold pants rather than a kilt, I think you'd think I was pretty cool. That's mostly down to the accent. But the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, I'm living proof that that point is wrong. I'm wearing a garment that was designed by my Scottish ancestors 900 years ago and is appropriate for a land where mostly people live on sheep and thistles grow 3 feet high. But the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, cultures and traditions survive over time. So, ladies and gentlemen, saying something as fundamental as eating meat can be erased in even the medium human term scale in the next 50 to 100 years, I think is really stretching it a bit. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, they said that food shortages, there are these huge food shortages, and it's immoral for us to be feeding cows instead of African children. Now, that's definitely true, and if I had a cow here and a starving African child here, and I think it would be a pretty easy choice who to give the ear of corn to. But it's not that simple. It's never that choice. The corn grows in a field next to the cow in a country which has got roads, which has got infrastructure. It's a very easy decision to hand that corn to the cow. It's not as simple as taking food from the mouths of animals and putting it into the mouths of Africans. To say so is a gross simplification, frankly. Banning meat eating is not going to solve the world's food problems. It needs a massive investment in infrastructure to do that. So let's move on to our positive reasons why veganism is wrong. And I think my first reason is definitely the strongest reason, and that is that they're banning ice cream, ladies and gentlemen. So if anyone here likes ice cream or enjoys gelato, you can't eat it. It's made of milk and eggs, because it's not just about meat-eating veganism. It's about getting rid of absolutely every animal product, even animal products that have nothing, that don't harm the animal when they're removed from it, ladies and gentlemen. So anyone out in the audience who's ever eaten ice cream or who enjoys ice cream, you can't really honestly vote for them unless you're willing to never have ice cream ever again. That's just a sacrifice I'm not willing to make. And I don't even think that much cruelty goes on in picking up eggs or milking a cow. I just don't think that's cruel, ladies and gentlemen. Anyone out there in the audience who owns a woolen jumper? By their standards, you're cruel. That's not allowed under their system. Anyone who, this is a very British thing, so I don't imagine there's anyone out there. This is very much a hometown crowd gig, but is there anyone out there that likes to have honey in their tea? It doesn't harm a beehive to take those things away. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, if animal products don't harm an animal to take away, why on earth are they banning them? How does it help the food shortage in the third world? We go, oh, no, Mohammed, no honey for you. I know that would save your child, but it's morally wrong to eat it. That belongs to the bees. We say, no, that's ridiculous. No, Mohammed, you can't have a woolen blanket to rest under tonight. That belongs to the sheep. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that's ridiculous. These people have needs. If you've got food shortages, you give them the food you've got, the food that's there to hand, and we say, if that's meat, if that's honey, if that's ice cream. I mean, I don't particularly want to live in the refugee camp that exists entirely in ice cream, but ladies and gentlemen, when I say if it existed, it would be wrong to keep the ice cream in a freezer and make people starve. Okay, moving on to my second point, which is the impact this has on farms, on communities, on people's way of life. I think things like property rights, things like the right to own your own land, the right to cultivate your own land, the right to own animals are important things. They're not just important to me, they're important to old, deep communities. There are cultural rights that are tied up in land and animals. If you want to turn around to a rabbi and say, no gefilte fish, I'm sorry, I know it's part of an important religious right, but I'm sorry, the UN has decided this isn't cool. That's just not going to fly, in my opinion, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to go to the French, and I've sat in French restaurants and been offered live snails, ladies and gentlemen, and say, no horse flesh, no live snail eating, I don't think they're going to buy into it because it's part of their sense, their essential sense of self, their essential sense of nationhood to be able to do those things. It's particularly true of more primitive cultures, people like the Maasai in Africa, who live very much in harmony with their cattle, running with the cattle across borders and drinking the cattle's blood to stay alive. Particularly in Norway, you see things like ritualized whale hunting, where men can't become men until they've killed a beached whale with their bare hands and so on, ladies and gentlemen. And the thing is, they're going to stand up and say, well, it's much more important that animals don't suffer cruelty than these people aren't allowed to do their barbaric things, this barbaric blood drinking and snail eating and so on. And I say no. I say in exactly the same way as religion is an important right. It may seem foolish when somebody else from somebody else's religion believes something very strongly, but I think these intangible, important rights, these things that make us different, these things that make these communities different, these things that make them unique are really, really important. And they're certainly important to these communities. And it's certainly not going to be won over by a UN committee deciding something. Also, ladies and gentlemen, I'll ask the question, what do animals really mean to our landscape? I mean, England's often described as a green and pleasant land. And that's mostly because we have an enormous amount of grass to graze cattle and sheep on. If we let that land lie fallow, because people aren't just going to, if you want to do this, you've got to change entirely the way we use land. You've got to get rid of sheep, you've got to get rid of cattle, and you've got to convert that all to something else, be it corn, be it mushrooms. I'm sure it's not as pretty as what we have at the moment. And the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, I think intensive agriculture is much more likely to be things like rice paddies. And if you're willing to go to Texas and turn around to a rancher who's got 10,000 head of cows, whose family have had that land for 200 years, and say, sorry, mate, this has all got to be rice paddies, the UN says so, then frankly, ladies and gentlemen, I think you're going to get shot. But beyond that, ladies and gentlemen, I also think it's not going to be enormously popular. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I was going to make a point about the future, but I've entirely run out of time. And the question I was going to ask about the future was, if you can grow meat in a test tube, which has been done successfully in the last 3 or 4 months, why on earth are we even having this debate? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you once again for the British team for putting up a great fight. I'm just going to go right ahead and tell you why we think we're winning. All right, so first off, I want to hit on some of the new arguments that were brought up, and just to clear things up. So some of the things that they argued was that we can't give people who need food aid the types of food that's grown for cattle in land that's near where cattle are herded. But the argument is that we're still using up a lot of arable land that could be used to still make food that can be taken and help those who do need some sort of food aid. Now, they argued that this, for some reason, cannot be moved over to help these groups of people, but there are organizations that the main purpose, like the UN Food Aid Program and US Food Aid, their goal is to provide these people with food aid. So now, if we change this mindset to that of veganism, we can eliminate this unnecessary use of land and use it to still grow food for people who actually need it, instead of cows who then go and get killed for food. Next, they argue that there needs to be some sort of reason to change the landscape. And like my partner said, we can't, as people, we have, and because we can and have the responsibility to promote these types of changes, that we can do this. And they continue to argue that there are certain groups of people that that depend on certain types of products that are byproducts of meat or have some sort of animal relation to animal products, like ice cream and wool. Now, we're not making you get rid of or stop eating ice cream altogether. There are vegan ice creams. I've had them. It's delicious. And additionally, it's not necessary for us to take things from animals unnecessarily. Even though taking wool may not actually kill a sheep, it still is using the animal as a product instead of respecting it as an animal. And this doesn't have to continue because there are faux leather, wool, etc., other types of things that sometimes you can't even tell the difference. So the argument that all of a sudden, we have to get rid of all of these necessary items like ice cream and wool it's not really true, because there are substitutes for these items that can be just as good as they are. And they also say that will be taking away the individuality of different cultures. However, when we see something that is wrong, whether or not it's part of some sort of culture or individuality, we have to act upon that. And as Western liberal democracies, we have the responsibility to take some sort of action and prevent something that is harming not only our environment, but our health, as well as the moral implications of using animals as products. So we have this responsibility to prevent this from continuing. And they seem to think also that all of a sudden switching to a vegan diet won't have any health benefits. Like they said that that changing to vegan diet won't prevent deaths. However, there is research that shows that it will. For example, there are studies on individuals who had some sort of cardiovascular disease, and over 32 months of having switched to a vegan diet, that cardiovascular disease has no longer existed. So there is evidence of this happening, and considering how much of a big deal these health risks are, it's important for us to consider that promoting this vegan lifestyle is detrimental. Now, they also argue that there isn't a way for that people would just naturally choose to be vegan if we let them. However, the problem is that in the status quo, there aren't very many options for people who want to be vegan. Like he said earlier, the giant mushroom clouds of whatever disgusting that is, because there is a lack of there's a lack of promoting vegan diets. So obviously there aren't going to be very many delicious things for people who choose to go vegan because it's not in high demand. But when we promote a vegan diet or decrease the meat-centric mindset that we have right now, it'll increase the demand for these products, which will encourage producers to produce things that people actually want to eat. So once again, we have made our case to you that Western liberal democracies should promote a vegan lifestyle and back away from meat-centric industry just because it is not only necessary, but also justified to do so. So for these reasons, please vote for the affirmative.
Ladies and gentlemen, Proposition have a lot of faith in advertising. They essentially seem to think that we can talk and hint and hope and infomercial our way out of the global food crisis. And we of Opposition are a little bit more skeptical, because what they've told us is there are issues in the way that the world is right now, and that they will all essentially be solved if we could only convince large numbers of people to give up every pillar of the way that they live. Because as Willard has told you, food is so much more than what you sit down to eat, like occasionally a couple of times a day. It structures your entire culture. It structures your way of life. We think that they have attempted to paint this global restructuring as something a little bit too casual. So I'm going to look at the reasons that they have given us, the alleged issues right now with like people's ill health, with environmental damage, and with the problem of food shortages. And I'm going to essentially prove why everything they have given us is, like, at best, useful or convincing. It's certainly insufficient grounds for passing this massive blanket ban upon the way that, like, most people in the world tend to live right now. Because first off, on the health point of view, like Willard has told you already, that you cannot, like... Let's take an example. So we all know that certain things are bad for us. You can put the calorie count directly on the top of a box of Krispy Kremes, for instance, and you will register for a moment, this is unhealthy and not good for me. But it doesn't in any way undermine how much you want to eat it and how delicious it is. And whilst the health problem is like a balance between two bad things, and you know that you're damaging yourself exactly as you eat this like incredibly delicious Philly cheesesteak, that's not a ground on which rational people actually change their behavior, and it's also not a grounds on which an entire world food program can attempt to legislate in people's lives when there are other effects. And Willard again has told you about all of the effects. The way that worldwide veganism would completely decimate existing environments, would completely cut to the heart of who people are and how they live. And we don't think that this one example that like eating certain things is bad for you, which a lot of people know already, like potato chips are bad for you. They're not covered under their model too. If you're going to ban everything that's unhealthy, you've got a bit more work to do. We just don't see any like balance between this problem and this supposed solution. Now again, we've had the example of environmental damage. They're like, There's lots of water pollution as a result of industrial runoff. Well, let's not tip loads of slurry into moving water, and let's not support the worst industrial practices in the world. We think there's loads of grounds for improvement in factory farming. We'd do away with it completely if we could. A move towards higher welfare is not only compatible with worldwide meat eating, but it would be desirable for everybody, and we think it's totally practical. The idea that we need to do away with something because there are bad examples of it is hilariously broad in its application. And if you try to apply that to any other industry in the world, you'd pretty much have to get rid of everything because there are always some bad eggs. So we think let's just work to cut out the worst polluters and not make everybody the good old farmers, the good people who are treating their pigs correctly and sanitizing their barns correctly, give up what they're doing so well. Now, they also told us that there are food shortages around the world, and that banning meat is the solution. Now, Willard not only told you that food shortages are an issue primarily of infrastructure, the fact that you might have all the corn in the world next to your cows in Wisconsin, but nothing that you do in country X is going to affect what's going on in country Y, where there are no roads even connecting the capital, which might have loads of food, with these remote areas which simply don't have access to crops. So we think not only is it naive to believe that that the global food situation is one of simple maths, where you just go, okay, let's eat 2 fewer burgers over here, and then 6,000 kilometers to the east, there will be 2 more burgers. But we think it actually distracts attention from the real things that need dealing with, and we of the opposition would rather that we just looked at the problem on the ground and tried to sort that out, instead of robbing us of our bacon and our ice cream, which is so unfair. Now, in essence, we think Prop have told us that because we can do something, we should do it. We've heard that there's an existing mechanism for forcing change, that the UN Food Programme does stuff. We think that's awesome, but just because there are global laws and ways of circulating information around the world, that doesn't mean that we should circulate this specific example they've given us, because the information just is insufficient. It's not enough grounds for this huge ban. We think that if we wanted to solve the food crisis, there are so many more efficient ways which wouldn't just rob people of the daily choices that enrich their lives. And we would like to close our case with the example of soy ice cream and leave that with you as the reminder of what a vegan world would look like for you. We don't think it's delicious, and we don't think it's advisable. So many thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
Once again, thank you to the British team for coming and debating. At this point of the program, we will take a floor vote. So if you would like to vote for the proposition or the opposition, you would stand when I ask for that team. So if you are voting for the proposition team, could you please stand now? Okay, and the opposition side, please stand. Oh, I think it's a draw. No. It's very close to a tie, but because they've come such a long ways, we will declare the British as our winners tonight. That concludes our program. Thank you so much for coming.